share with you some views around this concept called community planning. And why I want to do that is that some of you, particularly elected members, may well have heard of community planning as a concept. But it is something that will be coming up in legislation around local authorities fairly soon. And why I'm particularly interested in it is I think it gives a real opportunity for the community and voluntary sector to work alongside elected representatives. And I think maybe for the first time for there to be like an equal dialogue. I don't mean that in a dismissive way in terms of local authority elected representatives, but I do think this is a mechanism, if you like, to provide a conversation, a useful conversation between the community voluntary sector and local authorities. So what I want to do in the course of the next, I don't know, 30 minutes maybe, is to really talk about four things. First of all, I want to celebrate, if you like, some of the political achievements that we've had in Northern Ireland, to at least note that we have moved on significantly in terms of our political agenda here. And as part of that, I want you to consider the whole concept that all of those achievements and progress going forward cannot be left solely to the Northern Ireland Assembly. This is where I think local leadership is hugely important here. The second thing that I want to talk about is how John Paul Letterick's work could offer us lots of opportunities here to explore a local leadership model, not in a theoretical sense, although I quite like that myself, but hopefully in a very practical way in terms of your own experience working both in the community and voluntary sector and local authorities. Thirdly, I want to share with you a little bit of detail on community planning as a concept and how it might offer those opportunities for you to become involved in something not only at the level of your own organisations, but more widely at the kind of strategic level within the local authorities that you currently reside. And fourthly, to encourage you to think about a future role in an environment where community planning will be a statutory element of local authorities' responsibility. So in short, what I'm going to try and do is to look at kind of where we are now, where we've got to, consider possibilities for you as local leaders and local representatives to look much more closely at some of the needs of your area beyond your own organisations, and then finally how you might become involved in that. I was going to say, does that seem okay? But I've got this prepared, so it's going to be okay. So, this is like teaching grandmother to suck eggs, but nonetheless, I'm going to just give you a little tour of kind of where we've got to right now. I think we have much to celebrate in terms of our political achievements so far. I should add that this isn't, I will not be coming to this from any particular partisan perspective, so if I age one way more than the other, it's clearly unintentional. But I think some of our celebrations clearly are around the securing of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which has provided us with a devolved assembly with full executive and legislative powers. Clearly, that did not get off to a great start with us. Between 1999 and October 2002, the Assembly was suspended 4 times. But since the St Andrews Agreement in 2006, we have had a breakthrough in the sense that we have had powers devolved back to our local assembly here in May 2007. And the First Minister has described this as the most settled period of devolution for over 40 years. And clearly the transfer of policing and justice powers back to the Assembly has been a huge development as well, but what is sometimes described by the media as the final piece in the devolution jigsaw. So, Those are, I think, political achievements that we should celebrate and pocket, if you like. But the question for me here is, has this translated into a shared society for us? Have we actually attained the goal of a shared society? And I just want to give you a few little stats around this. First of all, clearly we've had declining political balance, notwithstanding the very sad event that happened earlier this week, or was it last week, with the prison officer. But we have come on leaps and bounds in terms of the decline in our political balance and the degree of political stability that we have here. And one indication of this is given by a survey which the Policing Board, the Northern Ireland Policing Board, conducts on a yearly basis. And they ask the question, how much confidence do you have in the PSNI's ability to provide an ordinary day-to-day service for all people of Northern Ireland? And over time we've seen a growing Catholic confidence in terms of the answer to that question. So I think that is a positive development. We've also seen levels of crime associated with the security situation here decrease significantly, although we clearly have to acknowledge that the dissident threat remains. Probably can't see that very well, but let me talk you through it. If you compare the red line here is the number of shootings in Northern Ireland from 1998 onwards. The blue line, the red line is the number of shootings, the blue line is the number of deaths in Northern Ireland, and the green line is the number of bombings. Now, even if you can't see the detail of that, you can see, in terms of the spike in the graph, you can see that from 2001 onwards, we see an increasingly falling trend in these incidents that are related to our security situation here. In fact, if you compare the situation in 2011, there was one death due to terrorism compared to 470 in 1972 at the height of our conflict, which isn't actually captured in that graph because it doesn't go back far enough. So, how are we doing in terms of trying to move towards a shared society here in Northern Ireland? Well, many of you will know that we've had two significant policy documents around trying to create a more reconciled Northern Ireland. The first of which, many of you will know, was called A Shared Future. Now, some would argue the fact that A Shared Future as a policy document was devised by our direct rule ministers created a negativity towards that. Again, that's not a political point I am making, but simply to say that when our local politicians came back into power, almost by definition, anything that had been devised by direct rule ministers was seen as not particularly attractive to them. They saw it as policies that were agreed out with local control responsibility agreement, and therefore, by definition, were not good according to some of our local politicians. So, A Shared Future as a policy document was discarded by our local politicians, even though part of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement said, and I quote, "An essential aspect of the reconciliation process is the promotion of a culture of tolerance at every level of society, including initiatives to facilitate, encourage integrated education and mixed housing." I'm getting escape mention from Aaron Shortall. I don't know who that is. So, unfortunately, A Shared Future, I'm not saying everything in A Shared Future of itself was good, but that fell off the policy agenda. Now, our local politicians' attempts to create a strategic framework for reconciliation came in the form of the document entitled Cohesion, Sharing and Integration, CSI. It ran into major problems because, frankly, it wasn't particularly ambitious. And the criticisms included things like that it actually aimed to manage rather than eradicate sectarianism. So part of the difficulty there was, I think, in trying to bring a diverse range of political parties together at the local level to achieve some consensus around cohesion, sharing and integration. So, is Northern Ireland a more reconciled society since the Belfast Good Friday Agreement? Again, if I could just give you a little dip into some public attitudes here. A yearly question is done by an organisation called the Northern Ireland Life and Times Survey. And they asked the question right up until last year, they had no funding to do it last year unfortunately, would you say that relations between Catholics and Protestants are better than they were 5 years ago, worse, or about the same as now? Now the blue line here depicts people who felt relations between Catholics and Protestants were improving. The green line depicts relations as being the same, and the red line depicts people's views about those relationships getting worse. So again, given the smallness of this chart, you will see that the blue line is showing that people, a random controlled sample, so this can be generalized to the population, are saying that they felt relationships between Catholics and Protestants are better than they were 5 years ago. So that's an encouraging trend towards a more reconciled society. However, it's not all good news. Part of that process of reconciliation was to include social and economic regeneration, if you like, sometimes referred to as the peace dividend in newspapers. And the peace dividend was to, in a sense, give potential international investors an opportunity to invest in Northern Ireland. Really, it was Northern Ireland saying to other parts of the world, we are open for business. Since 1998, our economic progress has actually been very mixed. So between 1997 and 2007, we had a marginally higher rate of economic growth than other parts of the UK. However, from 2008 to 2011, our unemployment rates have increased, and in fact amongst young people during that period, it has increased by over 150%. There are also external or extraneous factors. This isn't all linked to our transition, if you like, from a conflict to a post-conflict society. Those extraneous or external factors have to do with the fact that we've had global crises, there's ongoing problems with the Eurozone and so on. So, and in particular, I suppose, some local issues. Our economy here is very much linked to the public sector. So about 30% of our jobs here are derived from the public sector. With a decrease in public expenditure, then we, by comparison to other parts of the UK, assume a disproportionate effect in terms of our employment here. And I suppose finally, in terms of this peace dividend, it is clear, and if one look at the statistics around this, particularly in deprived areas, socially deprived areas, that this peace dividend has not extended to working class areas. So, despite the fact that we have this political stability, it hasn't worked through into some of the socially deprived areas that perhaps you work in, or have a community organisation in, or as an elected representative, are actually representing some of those people. So, getting all the kind of bleak parts out of the way first, and then to talk about things more positive subsequent to this. But again, just to give you a little idea of some perceptions around all of this. Again, in this yearly survey, people were asked their opinion of how much they thought the Northern Ireland Assembly had actually achieved. And these were some of their views. You can see here that the red line was saying that the Assembly has only achieved quite a little bit of progress during its time in power. This is from 2002 onwards. The blue line says that it has achieved a lot, and the green line said it has achieved nothing at all. So what this diagram actually says, if we think of the first full electoral mandate of the Assembly as being from 2007 to 2011, because before that we were kind of in and out of government like a yo-yo. But what this graph is saying is that only about 50% of our population felt that the Assembly had actually achieved a little. So most people did not think during that period that the Assembly had actually achieved a lot. I should say here, and this is not a political point I'm making here, and the relevance of this will become clear to you when I talk about opportunities for you as local leaders to help with this process, but simply to acknowledge that during that period people did not think it achieved a lot. Now, what does not achieve a lot actually mean in practical terms? Well, some commentators would argue that the fact that that local administration stayed in power during the period 2007 to 2011 was actually a significant achievement. And I think there's a lot of mileage in that argument. But in terms of what it did for local communities that you lived in, that you work in, the suggestion here is that they did not do a lot. So they trumpet the fact that they increased at one point winter fuel payments. We do not have any water charges. We have free prescriptions, although that's looking dodgy. And we have free transport for people over 60. I'm looking forward to that in 9 months' time. But the trend overall has not been encouraging. As I said, that's not a political statement on my part, but simply to acknowledge that during that period it was about improving political stability. So how does all of this tie in a very tenuous way, you might think, to what John Paul Lederich has to say about linking what's going on at the macro level, the level of our Assembly, and what this all means to us as individuals who are working at the community level. So Lederich, who I had a very pleasurable experience of meeting about 5 months ago in Mauritania, where he's based, Lederich has this model that is very well known, that really says peace building takes place in a hierarchy. So there are about 3 broad levels of peace building, and each of those levels has different kinds of participants in that process. So if you look at tier 1, at the highest level of the pyramid, it's top leadership, military, political, religious, other leaders with high visibility. So if we're to adapt this to the circumstances of our local situation, tier 1 is our local assembly. So our elected leaders operating in a devolved administration with full executive and legislative powers operate at tier 1. Tier 2, Lederich defines as leaders respected in sectors, ethnic, religious leaders, academics, don't know how we got in there, intellectuals and humanitarian leaders as a middle tier. And the third level are people like yourselves, grassroots leaders, leaders in NGOs, locally elected representatives. Now, Lederich's thesis is as follows. He is saying that it's clearly very important for these people at the top level to influence the shape of our society. That's what we elect them to do. But he's also saying that because they're relatively few in number, 108 MLAs, that they have probably least experience of what's happening on the ground and how their policies impact on people on the ground. Now, I'm sure if there is an MLA in this room, he or she will assault me for that statement. But this is Lederich's model and his thesis. So he's saying, though, so they're responsible for making policies that have a significant impact on us, but they are least able to see the impact of that on the ground because of where they are. Moving to level 3, skipping level 2, level 3 is us, which is essentially saying there are far more of us. We have much greater understanding of how these public policies impact on people on the ground, but we don't have as much access to that decision-making forum at the top level as perhaps we would like. And in some cases, Lederich is saying that we're perhaps taking a far too narrow view of our own organisations to exert local leadership. So we're so understandably wrapped up in the dynamics of the organisation that we're involved with that we fail to see this more strategic picture. So Letterick's thesis is we need to connect these levels. His argument is that there's a level of interdependence between these three levels in the peace process, in any peace process. We need to be able to connect level 1 right through to level 3. And it is only when you do that that you will get peace, prosperity, better quality of life for people at local levels. So just to summarise in Letterick's words, his thesis, no one level is capable of delivering and sustaining peace on its own. We need to recognise the interdependence and activities across all the levels of these pyramids. Now, I'm sure Mary, who's going to talk to you about this afternoon, will do a much better job in explaining the detail of this, but from my point of view, that's Letterick in terms of local versus macro leadership. That's important for people in this work. So how do we do that? How do we connect? What mechanism do we have for ensuring that people operating in local organisations are able to connect through to that more strategic vision? And I will be suggesting to you that community planning is one such model. So, just to reflect a little bit on why it is important for local leaders like yourselves to be involved in this corporate responsibility for delivering and embedding peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. I just want to give you a quick overview of some of the things that we now have to face. It is clear there is political stability, and long may that continue. But there is also a suggestion that we've got a significant public policy deficit here in Northern Ireland. So many of the services, many of the public services in organisations that you work for, that you represent, that for people who are living in socially deprived areas, many of our public policies are not delivering to those people. And there's a school of thought that says the way in which our government is structured here in Northern Ireland is prohibitive in terms of meeting the needs of local communities that you represent. In other words, we've got 12 fairly large government departments in Northern Ireland, but they all operate in silos. They all operate along individual departmental lines. This is not good governance, and the reason we have 12, you will probably know, is because it took 12 departments to accommodate our power sharing arrangements, what political scientists call associationalism. That's not a thing to be negative about, but the implications of it are that our public services operate in a very fragmented way. So people in deprived areas do not see our governance arrangements as particularly good in terms of how they deliver public policies. The second thing is that we've moved into a system where we've got, it might be described at one stage as quangos, these bodies that weren't particularly responsible and accountable to local communities, into what we now have described as super quangos. So we've got bodies like 5 health trusts, 1 health and social care board, and so on. In health, we're about to get a super quango in education called the Education and Skills Authority, and we have quangos in our housing function around the housing executive and housing associations. So those 3 major areas of public policy, education, health and housing, are all operated by bodies that don't have the degree of elected accountability that we would like to see. And again, this is where I'm prompting a role for local organisations like yourselves. So in short, I'm saying there's a lack of focus here in terms of policy outcomes for citizens and service users, and there's limited engagement with stakeholders, and accountability is not particularly real. So let me just give you one example that I hope illustrates this. And this is an example around a relatively new policy called shared education. Shared education is not the same as integrated education. In fact, it's not like a sector or a movement, and that's not to decry all of the things that people who are working in the integrated sector are trying to do. But it's simply to say that thus far, our integrated education system has only been able to attract about 7% of the school population. So it has struggled since 1981, since the first integrated school appeared in Northern Ireland, the Lagan College. It has struggled to achieve higher levels of engagement than 7% of our population. Just to show you how segregated our school system is, if we look at primary schools, 5.4% of Catholic schools actually attend controlled schools or Protestant schools, to put that crude label on. So less than 1% of Protestants attend maintained or Catholic primary schools. So those numbers are very stark. If we look at our secondary school, our non-selective sector in education, 2.1% of Catholics attend controlled schools or Protestant schools, and only 0.8% of Protestants attend maintained schools. So our education system is hugely segregated, as you know, but those figures are particularly stark, I think. So one option here that has been considered by the Northern Ireland Executive is this thing called shared education. And shared education is basically a system which says, okay, we're not trying to make you into a hybrid of a Catholic and a Protestant, like a prolalic. But what we are trying to do here is to say that every parent wants his or her child to receive the best education possible. And that if we concentrate on the education product, in other words, if we concentrate on education as a core element of the school curriculum, we focus on education here rather than community identity, that parents will buy into this concept. So this initiative is really about trying to get schools cross-sectorally into shared classes, into a system where children learn together without, and this is important, without compromising on their community identity. So you're not asking them to come to integrated schools, you're accepting people have community ethos identities which they're proud of. You're not asking them to compromise on that, but you are asking them to share the education product. One byproduct of which is that it breaks down these kind of traditional barriers in our children at a very early age. So this is now part of our executive's programme for government. So they are supporting initiatives under this shared education initiative. So they have 4 commitments in our programme for government for shared education. The problem is, and they argue, the executive argues, that that has the potential to address and improve our education outcomes. There's a potential to eliminate or do away with much of the duplication that we have in our education system. So we share teachers, for instance, rather than having the same provision in one or 2 different provisions in one area, and it addresses segregation. The problem is, in our system of governance, that there's about 5 government departments that will have responsibility for the delivery of that. So typically, sorry, I'm giving the cameraman a lot of trouble here. Typically, the Department of Education is interested in this initiative to see whether it improves our education standards. Understandably, that's the case. The Office of the First Minister, Deputy First Minister, is interested in this initiative to see whether or not it promotes reconciliation, because they have responsibility for cohesion, sharing and integration. The Department for Regional Development is interested in this because they have an initiative around how could they encourage kids to walk or cycle to school more. DETI and DEL are interested in this from the point of view of will it improve skills attainment by kids who go through our school system. So for one initiative around about trying to address our segregated school system, we have 5 government departments who are interested in the outcomes. That inevitably leads to very poor governance. So, to the kind of meat of what I want to talk about today. How, if at all, can we change the system which is primarily very top-down, where you may feel either as local representatives or as community leaders that you have very little input into this system, and how can you widen your vision beyond your own organisation? So I'm suggesting that this new approach, which is called community planning, that will come into effect on a statutory basis from 2015. Be interested to hear some local government representatives talk about this. It will come into effect in 2015 when all of our councils are reorganised from 26 councils to 11 councils. This provides a real opportunity, in my view, for local leaders like yourselves to become much more active in developing your leadership role beyond the level of your own organisations. So community planning, in my view, is a statutory mechanism which will allow you to have much more strategic leverage at the local level. How will it do this? Well, this will be a body of probably male and female individuals, men and middle-aged men like myself. Hopefully not, but this will be a body where there will be, on a statutory basis, this is important, on a statutory basis, come together to agree a common vision for each of these 11 local authority areas. What's important is that people from the community and voluntary sector are there working alongside their elected representatives to encourage this common vision, to bring to the table your own expertise. Now, for those of you that have been round the track a few times, including myself, you will probably think not another partnership. We've gone through a phase of partnership-itis here. And I can understand its cynicism, but this is not another partnership. This will have a statutory basis. Local authorities will have to bring together a body of people that have this community vision, that can be held to account, can hold to account those statutory organisations that provide local services in their area. And how will they do that? Well, they will do that through this series of indicators called quality of life indicators, and hopefully it will move from this centralised system to focus on outcomes and local accountability. So in effect, I'm suggesting to you that community planning as a mechanism will move through that electric model of top-down elite decision-making through to bottom-up community voluntary sector engagement, working with local representatives. So the purpose of community planning is to place a statutory duty on local authorities to prepare a community plan in consultation with other service providers who will be required to cooperate fully in the planning process. This should result in a citizen-focused public services delivered in a coordinated way. So community planning is any process through which a local authority comes together with other organisations to plan, provide for, or promote the well-being of the communities they serve. So if I were to ask you, just as a little bit of comment and feedback, you're all community leaders in your own areas. You're all either elected representatives or community people. Just for 2 minutes to write down what you think are the 4 main priorities in your area. Now this is moving outside of the organisation that you are representing here today, but you're all people who are well steeped in your own communities. So if I were to say to you, what are the 4 main priorities in rank order? What are the 4 main priorities for your area in terms of local needs? You just take 2 minutes to have a go at that, please. Okay, folks. Okay, so I've asked you to come up with 4 key priorities, if you like, for your table. Just trying to assess what you think from your experience of working in the community voluntary sector or as elected representatives. What do you think are the key priorities in terms of public service needs in your area? So maybe start back, please.
Four but not in rank order this week.
Yep.
Health, education, and that's looking at integration. Employment, and transport.
Good. Thank you very much. Now, as I go around the table, if anybody else has these priorities, just drop them off your list. So only give me the priorities that don't appear. So the last group is going to have different time. Okay. So okay, let's take this table. The additional one you would put on there is youth. Youth, right? Yeah. How about the table tax? You're done.
We have a number of those obviously key lumps youth and skills-based employment under education. The additional one we have is rural services, because a number of the councils that we represent have large rural areas and transport infrastructure.
Okay. Transport rural service, thanks Lynn. This group? Housing. Housing, social housing? This group? Okay, so there's no councillors at this table? Okay, better. How honest of you. So better representation, can I put it in shorthand? Okay, I'm gonna take that under employment because I have no more page. Please.
I think most areas covered there. The result of all the substance abuse will come on the conference goes outside the prison. Advice for older people.
We say substance abuse.
Alcohol substance abuse.
Let's do it as a separate one. Okay, so I just want to do make one more quick exercise if I can. Okay, so if you just listen to this list overall here, not in rank order: substance abuse, health, education, employment, transport, youth, rural services, social housing, better representation, diversity, and poverty. Could you, in your own tables, just rank the top 4 from those? So from that list, substance abuse, health. Can I just take that again, folks? Substance abuse, health, that might be related, but just treat them as separately here. Okay, well, can I lump that into substance abuse, health is 1, education, employment, transport, youth, rural services, social housing, better representation, diversity, and poverty. So, could you just in your own tables come up with the top 4 for those, please? What you would deem to be the top 4? Okay, folks, how are we going? No? A bit more time? Okay. How are we doing? Any results in yet? Okay. Okay, so you've got to listen to, I know Louise doesn't allow me to use the word rules, but I'm an academic, so maybe I'm allowed to do that just for today. So the rules at this point is as follows. I'm going to go around each table and say which service did you, I'm going to go down these services here and ask which was agreed as the first choice, second, third, and so on. So when I say who put substance abuse as first on their list, somebody in that group will raise their hand. So I want to get a ranking here in terms of is there any consensus in this room around what would be the local needs for areas around your table. So let me start off then. In terms of first priority, which group put substance abuse as first? Which group put health as first? So 1, 2, 3. 3 out of 8 groups put health first. Education first. 1, 2 groups. Employment first. 1, 2. Transportation first. No. Youth first. No. Rural services first. No. There's still one group holding out on me.
Because we live employment, we live from the generation, we live that.
You're messing up like See, the benefits of this, the thing about this game is you can smoke out of the centres.
Yeah, our first choice was better and stronger representation. Being our first choice. To bring about the understanding.
Hold on a second here. So you see the groups 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we've got 9 first choices. Who's voting early enough? Okay, so your first choice was?
Better and stronger representation.
Okay. Okay, so second choice, the game gets easier as you learn rules. Second choice, substance abuse. Second choice, health. 1, 2, 3, 4. Thank you, Lynn. Yeah, you throw me. Education, second choice. 1, 2, 3 groups. Employment, second choice.
Sorry, that was rough.
Can we change ours?
It's too complicated.
Employment so we can have better health services and a better education service.
I was employment was actually ours.
Okay, that's good. So in this highly scientific game that we're preparing, what we're saying here is, if I had a bigger board I could show you this better, but essentially we're clustering around health as a key priority here, education, employment as the next key areas, and then for the fourth area there's a diversity. So health, education, employment, and a smattering of employment, transportation. Probably if we took the third choices in there in terms of employment, that would be health, education, employment. Now, after that hugely scientific exercise and lots of rules, is that any big surprise to you, do you think, that people like yourselves should be saying that priorities in our local areas are health, education, employment, and a mixture of one or two other things?
One thing I would say, we had encountered this in our table, it's the difference between rural, what's required in the rural area and what's required in the rural.
And what would be those key differences, do you think?
That's why we have housing.
Access? Transportation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's going to be particularly true, for instance, if you look at the whole policy that's going on in schools at the moment. The fear of closing schools in rural communities will often pull the heart out of that community, because if you don't have schools in there, other services will follow. So, just to distill, if you like, the messages from here, is it doesn't take you to be too scientific to understand that the key public service requirement in these areas is around health, education, housing, employment. Those are the kind of key areas. So, just to link this into your role, the local authority role, the Letteric model, community planning, this is really about saying, if we understand those needs for an area, in other words, if we have a common vision for what's needed around those public services, how do we, as local community representatives or local community involved organisations, feed into that process where our voice is heard? In other words, how do we articulate our needs in a way that's holding those public bodies to account for delivery in our area? Because the criticism, according to Letteric, is that our local voice is not heard. There's not that degree of interdependence between those levels. For those of you who are local government representatives, you will know that often large statutory organisations turn up to local authorities. I don't think it's overstated to say that they're often quite arrogant about what's required for their local authority areas. They're usually fairly unwilling to listen to the views of local representatives, and they go off and do their own thing. So this community planning process is really attempting to say, we need that local input at the level of NGOs, local leaders. So it is about creating a vision statement for a local authority around a small number of high-level cross-cutting themes. Those are the cross-cutting themes that we've just developed there. An action plan that links those themes with measurable targets and outputs, and I hear you kind of cringing around measurement here. Well, one of the things that community planning is really saying is that there needs to be a kind of formal commitment to this plan. Once you have devised these key issues that are important for a local community, there needs to be a commitment by those statutory organisations that have a direct responsibility for those public services at the local level to you as community leaders. So if you know that those needs are around health, education, housing, employment, how are you making those larger government departments accountable to you as local leaders? And that's essentially what the community planning process is about. So typically it's about a local authority's vision, and we've done a pilot community plan, just excluded the name of the local authority. It's not actually anybody in this partnership, but it was to say, to make Ballymena, Ballymoney, Larne, Moyle, Coleraine, or whatever. It was a partnership. Yeah. To make Coleraine a prosperous, healthy, sustainable and quality place in which people live and work as citizens of that community. So it is about accountability at that local level. So in fact, just to show how brilliant you were with the little exercise, when we did this in ex-council, these were the priorities in rank order: the economy, health, education and lifelong learning, and community safety and policing. Those were the priorities that were, when we got focus groups of community representatives like yourselves around the table, we got elected representatives, NGOs involved in this. Those were the themes that they said were critical as local leaders to the communities in which they are working. This particular community in which this exercise was done. Now, other areas will have perhaps different priorities, but I suggest to you, on the basis of that highly scientific exercise that we just went through, that it's probably not that different. Probably not that different. And the real challenge here is, how do we make public bodies accountable to your needs at the local level? So, I'm not going to go through these measures in any detail. I just want you to understand the concept here. If we're saying that those priorities are around health, education, the economy and so on, how do we hold those people to account? Well, one way in which we do it is through what's now called quality of life indicators. And it's basically to say, again, rather than looking at public services in a way that are very top-down here, that say, well, we're the housing executive, so we will decide what's needed here. We're the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Development. We will decide what's required for each of these local areas. We're the Department of Education. We will decide what is required for your local area. But for each of these key public policy areas, there is a set of indicators that says these try to capture the quality of people's lives. They're not provider driven. They're not driven by the organisations that are providing these services, but rather how they impact on the quality of people's lives at the local level. So the Audit Commission and GB came up with these indicators around some of these thematic areas that you have looked at. And there's not a whole raft of these indicators, there's 40 in total, that basically say if we can track the quality of people's lives in our local area, then we will know whether or not local leadership has been impactful in improving the quality of people's lives. And the quality of people's lives are impacted by the quality of healthcare, their quality of education, whether they're in or out of work. So they've come up with a number of these indicators that illustrate that. So I'm not going to go through the detail of these, but I'll give Louise my slides, and if you want to look at them in some detail. So that first set of indicators was around community cohesion and involvement. The second set was around community safety. The third set was around education. And the fourth set was around health and social well-being. So how do we hold these statutory organisations to account for public services that are provided in each of the 11 local authority areas? In practical terms, I'll leave this with Louise, it's really about saying, what will we do around these areas of activities? How will we do it? What are the targets for statutory organisations to achieve? And who will be the lead partner? So for instance, if one were to take poverty as a theme, one or two of the groups illustrated that. No single department has a single responsibility for poverty as a strategy. Poverty can involve all kinds of things around people's health, their well-being, their education, and so on. So this is really about saying in a composite way, how do we hold these departments to account? And what role does the voluntary community sector play in making sure that that happens? So, to conclude, this has been run in pilot form in a couple of local authorities, and myself and a few other colleagues have been involved. In a practical sense, the way it works is as follows. At the outset, community representatives, the NGO sector and their local representatives come together to agree this vision. What are the priorities? What targets will we use to track whether those priorities have been achieved? To what extent does achievement of those create a better quality of life for people living in those areas? They come together to agree that plan. Thereafter, the key statutory bodies that have responsibility for these functions are invited onto a community planning forum. So if your number one priority is health, you have somebody at a very senior level there from one of the trusts, and he or she has a responsibility to that community planning partnership for delivering health deficits in that area. If one of your priorities is education, you have somebody from the Department of Education, or ESA, the Education and Skills Authority, who sits on the community planning partnership and is accountable to elected representatives and NGO leaders for the delivery of those education deficits that you've identified, and so on. So the community planning table comprises a number of elected representatives, a number of NGO organisations, and the statutory bodies represented at the senior level who are accountable for delivering on these priorities. In other words, over a period of time, what you're trying to do is to say, we have identified public policy deficits in these areas, in our area. We know it because we work on the ground. We want to hold statutory organisations to account for the delivery of those services, and if they are not delivering, then we want to know why. Community planning has the potential to improve the quality of people's lives as judged through these indicators, and for statutory organisations to be held to account if they default on improving those services in local area. So where's the local leadership in that? Well, the local leadership is for you moving out of the specific requirements of your own organisation. I know many of you do this on a voluntary basis, but it's to move out of the specific requirements of your own organisation and to take a slightly more strategic view of the things that will improve the quality of people's lives in their local areas based on your knowledge and expertise of working with these people. And that's where the letter moving from the top to that wider base is that's the level of interdependence. You as local leaders holding to account those people that are essentially responsible for the distribution of 10 billion pounds of public expenditure on a yearly basis. So why isn't the quality of our lives in your particular, why is it not improving? Where are the deficits in terms of the quality of life in your experience, and how can you better hold them to account? So what is novel, I think, about this approach is the following. First of all, it's statutory. By 2015, there will be 11 community planning partnerships. Secondly, it allows input from local community leaders like yourselves, sitting at a table and holding very large statutory organisations to account. Thirdly, it allows you to track their progress in terms of the quality of life in your area. And fourthly, if public sector organisations are not performing, then you can benchmark it against the other 10 local authorities. So why is the Department of Education not delivering some of the education deficits in our area when they're doing it in 3 neighbouring areas? What is the problem here? And just to conclude, just to finish at this point, and I hope this isn't described in an overly complicated way, but statutory organisations are fearful of this process. That suggests to me, in maybe a blind way, that it's a good thing. Because statutory organisations see their responsibility in a vertical way. So I always get vertical from horizontal mixed up. In a vertical way. So they see their responsibility upwards to the Minister and the Assembly. So if I'm a civil servant in the Department of Education, my accountability is through the Minister, John O'Dowd, through to the Assembly. That's a normal democratic line of accountability. So it's a vertical line of accountability. What community planning is saying, well, actually you should also have a horizontal level of accountability. So you should have a responsibility at the community level. And that, in a sense, ties into the LETRIC model. LETRIC is saying at the top end, you've got this pinnacle, this hierarchy, with few decision makers at the top. Horizontal accountability, which is that way, is saying, well, actually you've got a wide responsibility for people who live in communities. So I just leave you with that thought. I think there is major potential here for community planning as a significant asset for you as community leaders to get involved in, become knowledgeable about, to hold these public bodies to account, and in a more strategic way to impact more positively and more significantly on some of the groups that you as individuals represent. That's for community organisations, for elected representatives, whoever you are in the audience. I think it's a very strong opportunity for elected representatives to hold those statutory organisations to account who for many years have ignored, frankly, elected representatives. Because local authorities here, as you probably know, have relatively small powers, although they're getting some more by 2015, but they still will not have their hands on the levers of these major services. They still will not have their hands on health, education, employment, and so on. So community planning offers an opportunity here for 2 things: local representatives to hold those statutories much more comprehensively to account, and local leaders to become involved in a process that is aimed collectively at building the quality of life for people in those areas. Thank you.